Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. David Searcy, and I'm joining you here from the beautiful campus of Southwestern Oklahoma State University. And this is the first discussion of what will be a series of online discussions about um, not just religion and politics, but religion and, we're going to use that in the broadest possible term. So we're going to talk about some sociological issues. We might talk about some bills or other things coming up, but mostly um, what I'm interested in discussing with you is the way in which religion is studied by political scientists and sociologists. We're going to talk about some of the interesting findings in this realm, and we're going to, kind of go through and look at how do people in the social sciences um, study religion. So I'm an assistant professor of political science here at Southwestern Oklahoma State University. Um, I got my PhD in political science from Southern Illinois University. And so this will be kind of an exploration of religion in, broadly speaking, American politics, although we could theoretically expand beyond that. And so if you're going to talk about religion and politics, to me, number one step is if you want to make the argument that somebody's religion affects their politics or their the way they interact in society, well, then you have to ask the question, what makes someone religious? And what makes someone religious in a way in which we can measure it? That's just as important. Um, we can just ask people, are you religious? There's a couple problems with that. One is, as the television character Dr. House used to say, everybody lies. Beyond that, though, just the fact that sometimes people tell us information that is incorrect, there's also the fact that if you just ask someone, are you religious? A person could interpret that in any number of ways. Maybe they think of themselves religious because they do some things, but I, the researcher, am conceptualizing religion in a different way. I'm thinking of it in a different mode. Now, if I'm, why might that be a problem? You might ask. Well, if I'm thinking that religion is someone being religious means they're doing that, this is happening, and they think it's something else, then we're not on the same wavelength, and they're giving me answers that I'm not really looking for, and it upsets my data. It also upsets the conclusions I can draw from that data. And there are numerous examples of times in the history of surveys and things where such has occurred. If the respondent does not understand the question, then the data is not going to tell me what I think it does. So, how do political scientists and sociologists determine if someone is religious? Well, there are three main things that we look at. But before I get to those, I want to talk about something that research has consistently found has no effect on whether someone's religion is impacting their behavior, their politics, etc. And that is knowledge. Religion for most people is not knowledge. Knowledge is not going to take that. So, what do I mean by knowledge? Well, knowledge would be where if I asked someone questions about a faith tradition, and then I marked them down and said, okay, this person doesn't know basic facts. And again, basic facts are important. In this kind of a scenario, you wouldn't ask someone, you know, what is the meaning of Jesus's death in the Gospels? You wouldn't do that because that's a matter of faith and interpretation, and different Christian groups are going to come up with different answers. You would want to ask factual questions. So, a factual question we might ask, say, about the Old Testament is, um, Where did Moses get the Ten Commandments? Um, I actually did this in class once, and I said, "What where did Moses get the Ten Commandments?" And one of my students said, "Well, he got it from the burning bush." No, that's factually incorrect. That literally open the book of Exodus. You'll find that that's incorrect. You could ask things like, you know, who is Jesus's mother? You could ask to name the disciples. If you were asking a person of Islamic faith, you might ask them to name the five pillars, and there are factually correct answers to those questions. But one of the things we found is that knowledge is not a good measure of religion in that it doesn't predict things. Um, there are a lot of people to whom their religious faith matters a great deal, but they can't answer a lot of factual questions about it. Now, is that necessarily is that depressing? It can be. You might view it and think of it as a depressing fact that people of faith cannot articulate it. But social science and political science, social scientists, in particular political scientists, have long known that people often join and have very strong attachment to groups that they can't really articulate about very well. Um, in fact, one of the first major pieces of political science research was a big study done back in the 1950s called the American Voter. And in that study, they found that people often received their partisanship from their parents. They largely were joining the same parties their parents did, but what they found is people weren't able to articulate what that party stood for very well. In fact, some people had it exactly wrong. So they were to put this in a modern context, is the example I was used. It would be like if you interviewed somebody and they said, "I am pro-choice. Um, a woman's right to choose is the single most important thing to me. So that's why I voted for Republicans down the ballot." Okay. The person's belief and attitude is their own belief and attitude. We can't say that their interpretation is wrong. But what we can say is if that is your stated view, you voted for the wrong candidate. And we find that in the American voter, they found this a lot, in particular related to labor issues. There were a lot of people who were really pro labor and yet voted for Dwight Eisenhower. Um, so that again, to Dwight Eisenhower, to give you an idea how old that study is, to give you an idea how long back we've been doing this. So it's in some ways unsurprising that people don't know many facts about their religious faith. Um, okay, so if it's not knowledge, if we forget knowledge, then what are how would you measure religion? Well, let's think about it. How would you define religion if you, the viewer, were sitting there and you wanted to say religion is this? Largely speaking, there are three main forms of religion. What scholars of religion often call the three B's, with a tip of the hat to the three R's of reading, writing, arithmetic. But in religion, they are believing, behaving, and belonging. So let's unpack each of those. We'll start with believing. In this kind of a conception of religion, what you're saying is that religion is something that you believe, that you believe in whatever, and that makes you a member of a group. So you would say, okay, you would to use Christianity as an example, since this is an American focused discussion. You would say, okay, let's take Christianity, by far the largest religion in the US, and let's break it down. And we'll say, if you believe these certain things, then you are a Christian. Okay. Or if you believe certain things, you have some agreement. Um, this can be quite helpful. There's a lot of positives to this. Just because one thing that it allows us to do is allows us to, as we'll see in one of the later ones, Um, Assuming that all members of a particular religious faith believe the same things or should believe the same things is often not good, right? We find all kinds of people who believe all kinds of different things. And if we're going to conceptualize religion in a belief system, this allows us to pull people out and we're not making assumptions. An example of this is when I was doing my dissertation, I used a Pew Religious Landscape Survey from 2014. I used other data sets, but I used that one, and I'll always remember that because there were 8 people in that survey. It was a survey of tens of thousands of people, so there were 8, not a lot, but 8 people who said they were Southern Baptists. They reported going to church at least a couple times a month, and they were absolutely certain that there was no God. So, like, sometimes people have behavior. Maybe those people misunderstood the question. I would assume at least some of them did. But sometimes people do very odd things. A My doctoral advisor knew a guy who he identified as Catholic. Um, he took his mother to mass every single week. He was a professor at SIU, and he took his mother to mass every week. And that was something that was really important to him. This religious practice of going to mass with his mother was really important to him. But as he told my doctoral advisor, wasn't 100% sure that God existed. Okay, so this happens. Beliefs are a good way we can do this. We can avoid this problem. Um, in terms of American politics, the one you see used most commonly in this vein is actually not dealing with the existence of God, but it is with literalism. So we often don't use the term fundamentalism. It's a loaded term, and in a later discussion we can unpack that. But we often use the term literalism. So we'll ask a question where we try to separate people out into people who view the Bible as that it should be interpreted literally, people who say, well, the Bible is inspired, but we shouldn't interpret it literally, and then people who say, it's just a book of fables and it has no bearing, something like that. Um, Again, that helps because it allows us to we can put all the literalists into one bag. And just as I was using examples of people who um, reported attending churches that espouse views that they, maybe weren't 100% sure on, you can also find the opposite. So you can find denominations of Christianity that are non-literalist. Their official denominational doctrine is that the Bible should not be interpreted literally, and you can find literalists in those traditions too. So you can find people all over the mess. Beliefs allow us to kind of say, okay, well, this is literalism. Um, there are some negatives to beliefs. Um, the first of which is that literalism is not consistent. I'm going to say that again. Literalism is not consistent. And here's what I mean by that. The Bible is a book written by lots of different people over thousands of years. And sometimes it tells us seemingly different or contradictory things. I think that's one of the beauties of the Bible, but that's my own personal opinion. Um, the problem with using literalism, though, is that in terms of practices, beliefs, behaviors, different people are going to focus on different parts of the Bible. Just to use one example of 2 groups that are literalist. Southern Baptists and Pentecostals are going to have very different views on the existence of things like spiritual gifts or speaking in tongues, for example. Some are going to point to some passages, some are going to point to other passages. You have groups who are going to differ on things like the ordination of women. You're going to have groups who have different views on the playing of music and in worship services. You have differences of opinions on how festivals are to be done, on how churches are to be organized together. You find differences all over the map, even among people who are literalists. Literalism can help us in some frames. Um, if we're looking at, say, you could argue that it's helpful if you were to look at maybe the effect of religion on opinion towards evolution or uh, towards LGBT issues, where you do have more of a consistent view on those literalistic passages, but it's not going to work everywhere. So that's an important thing to note. Um, the other problem with beliefs, and this was brought up in a very interesting article that I'd love to discuss more in a later lecture, where sometimes, and this, by the way, is common outside of religion too, people very often, when they're asked questions, don't want to look dumb or bad. One place we see this is in the question outside of religion. One place we see this is in the question, did you vote? People always over-report voting. So if I do a survey kind of after an election, I ask people, did you vote? I'm going to get a higher response to that than actually voted. Now, some of that is these are the people who are also willing to participate in a survey. But one thing we also are pretty sure is going on here is that even people who don't vote know they should vote, right? That this is kind of a thing that you're supposed to do. Now, does everyone do it? Of course not. But there are a lot of people out there who don't vote, but feel kind of embarrassed by that. And if they're asked, they will tell us that they voted. What does this have to do with beliefs? Okay. So sometimes people will hear statements. If we like, say we give them a list of things, let's say we're asking about a lot of different beliefs. People will hear these things. And even if that belief is outside of their faith tradition, they'll think, oh, that must be a part of my faith tradition. Why would you else have you asked me that? And they'll say they believe it, even if they probably don't. Um, there's a very interesting article where what they found was people who attended historically Black Protestant churches. So African American Methodists, African American Baptists, and African American Pentecostals mostly. Um, when asked if they believed that during communion, the uh, the wine and the bread turned into the literal body and blood of Christ, overwhelmingly agreed with that statement. It's a concept called transubstantiation from Catholicism. It is not a statement of belief in these other traditions, right? So I mean, maybe we could argue it with the Methodists, but particularly with the Baptists and the Pentecostals, which are the two largest of the African American church in the United States. That's not a statement of belief there. So what's going on? They heard the question and they said, okay, and they were just answering, and they were just answering, yes, I believe that to every single form of belief. Why? Because they were trying to demonstrate to the questioner, I am a devoutly religious person. So they were agreeing to everything. That happens all the time, by the way. Um, so that's a problem with belief, right? And it gets us down into like very nitty things, and even biblical literalism, right? Um, if somebody tells you they're biblical literal, forget all this stuff about differences between Baptists and Pentecostals. Think of it like this: someone would have combined it with that knowledge thing. Someone tells you, I view the Bible that it's the literal word of God. Does that mean they actually know what is in the literal word of God? You're making an assumption if you do that. So it's not perfect. But again, as we often say in social sciences, nothing we do is perfect. Um, the next form beyond believing is behaving. Okay. So in this, what you're saying is someone is religious if they are engaged in certain religious behaviors. Um, by far the most commonly two used ones. And they are commonly used for a couple of good reasons, largely because they're pretty consistent across religious traditions, even non-Christian ones, is worship attendance and prayer. Worship attendance most, but then prayer second. So what we do is we ask people, hey, about how many times do you attend church? And it goes from never to, well, you know, Christmas and Easter, as we call them, Reesters in my tradition, all the way down to I'm going to church multiple times a week. This can be, again, a positive thing. One thing it can do is it tells us how much ingrained within a group you are. So you may say you are a Christian, but then you also tell us that, well, you don't go to church hardly at all. So what that tells us is something like, you're not, you are something about there's it's not to belittle your identification or your faith. You have something because you wouldn't you're still identifying with it. But what it doesn't tell us, it shows that you're disconnected from the actual people in that group. So we can do that. Behavior is a good way to do it. Behavior is also probably one of the ones that you see very commonly when we mix and match the three B's. And so behavior becomes a way that we can separate out people by like, okay, well, these people are more closely in line, more closely embedded in the group, and these people are less closely embedded in the group. Um, the negatives of this, though, are that this is the one people lie about. Just like people know they should vote, people who often identify with the religious faith know that they probably should be going to church. Um, and so this becomes a problem. Um, and they tend to overestimate their church attendance. One classic study of this went around and they went to people's houses and they asked people a series of questions. And one of the things they asked was how often they attended church. And then as they were leaving, they kind of made a note of what their cars were that were in the driveway. And then they went around on Sunday morning to see how many of them actually were at church and found that people overestimated their attendance of church. People who told them, oh, I'm there every week. And then Saturday or Sunday came by and they went down there and they weren't there. So that happens. Um, so people overestimate. If we're being charitable, a good way to think of this, though, is that people often answer the question, how often they go to church, as how they think of themselves as a churchgoer. And let me explain this. Um, if you were to ask me, Dr. Cersei, how often do you go to church? I would say every week because I go to church every week. But, a few weeks ago, I got sick. I woke up, was running a fever. I stayed home. How do I answer? So how do I answer this? If they said, if I'm asked a question of, hey, how often do you go to church? Well, maybe I think of myself as going to church all the time, except for, well, I just happened to get sick that day. That happens a lot. Um, Another thing that happens that we often find is people sometimes forget what it is they did. Because a lot of these surveys are done like on Thursday or Friday. We ask them, hey, did you go to church last week? Yeah, we went to church last week. And then it's like after they got the phone, then it becomes like, oh, wait a second. The Timmy had a ball game, or this happened, or that happened, or the car had a flat tire. We went, but we usually go, but there was some calamitous event. So we often do find that too, of sometimes people are just mistaken. So it's not a perfectly accurate representation of people's actual behavior. So we always have to take that into account. The last thing I want to say about behavior that's a potential problem here, and this is something that I often think about in my own research, but it's that particularly when you get on the high end of the scale of a church attendance measure. Not every faith tradition is the same. Here's what I mean by that. Most mainline or many churches have worship on at some point on Sunday. But there are other churches that have multiple services in a week, but some don't. So let's say you're attending a church that has a Sunday morning, a Sunday evening, and a Wednesday night service. And you say, I'm attending church twice a week. Okay. Um, One, that gives you a lot more variability. You could actually be attending the Wednesday and Sunday when the attendance is going to be lower. And so you're not connected with the bulk of the church. But the other thing is, there are a lot of churches that don't have multiple services in a week, once a week. In those faith tradition, in those contexts, once a week is the most you can go. But some churches have the option to go more than that, right? So, how do we compare those? What do we do with this kind of top end of the scale, particularly when some people are embedded in faith communities where they don't have the option for higher end on the scale? That's a tricky question. The third B, of course, is belonging. So we had religion as a belief. Religion is what you believe. But behavior, religion is what you do. You engage in practices. That's religion. The third is religion is belonging. Religion is where you go. Religion is a community. Um, One of the values of this is it does allow us to make some assumptions about beliefs on a range of issues without having to ask multiple questions on it. So if we know you belong to a religious faith that has women ministers, we can make some assumptions about your beliefs. It That's going to be tricky, right? And it's not going to be perfect, but we can assume that, if your church has a female minister and you're still there, at the very least, it's not a deal breaker for you, right? Um, the other thing is that it allows us, the researcher, to lump people together in a way, groups who have similar beliefs together, which is actually kind of helpful because just like we said, that people don't know much about their own faith tradition, is when we talk about knowledge, people know even less about other people's faith tradition. Um, Belonging also tells us about the group that you associate yourself with. So there's a lot of research about how things have impact on your religious faith, that things have impact on your religious faith related to the group that you are in. In fact, this is often actually given as one way that religion affects politics. So, give you an example. Let's say that you are embedded in a church community, but you are not interested in politics. You don't watch the news, you don't follow along. It's just kind of this thing that's in the background. Um, Research tends to find it to be very spotty on political messages directly from the pulpit. They're not as common as non-religious people think. But let's say you're embedded in this faith community, you're not engaged in politics, and yet you go out into the parking lot after service, and 7 of the 10 cars out there have Trump bumper stickers on. You might think, okay, well, I'm not engaged in politics, but the people who I associate myself with that are politically aware are going in this direction. There must be some reason I must go that direction. The other thing about politics and worship, right, is in my experience, and my experience is a little weird because I'm a political scientist, right? But where I get more church politics related questions and discussion is actually not during worship, it's after worship or before worship. It's during coffee hours. It's during potluck dinners. It's during, simple soup suppers during Lent. Like these are all the times when people are engaging in a group. So knowing where you belong, where we fit you into, is actually quite handy. We get sometimes people will use not a lot of times people here will use denomination. Sometimes people will use like a religious identity, born again, evangelical, some like broad term. We'll talk about that in a different context later, but in a different lecture later, I should say. Now, what is the problem with using uh, denominational identity? The first is it's really, really hard. Why is it really hard? Because there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different Christian denominations in the US. We don't know how many denominations there are. They're not required to be registered anywhere because of the protections of the First Amendment. Um, but we know it's a lot. People give us uh, very disparate answers to this question. And there are, the example I always like to give is that in the Pew Religious Landscape Survey, there are 75 listed different kinds of Baptist. Not 75 different types of Christianity, 75 different kinds of Baptist. And again, I want to stress this. There's a huge array of denominational diversity. Get in your car today, drive around your hometown, and I guarantee you there's more than one church, right? There's some big ones, but there's also people who are involved in all these little ones. And so you have to be very careful how you measure that. And we can talk about that in a later lecture. Um, so it's hard. The other problem with uh, using denominational identity is that we know that there are people in churches who are rejecting their church's denominational identity, either because they've thought about it and rejected the church. Maybe they like the rest of the teachings or they like the community, but they reject this one specific one. Or, as in the case of knowledge, they might just not know what it is they're talking about. But the example I always think of in this vein is I had a student many years ago, and he was Catholic. And he talked about being Catholic all the time. And so one day, I'm in my I'm coming into class and I'm getting everything set up, and the students are sitting in their desks having a discussion. And the young man who was Catholic said something to the effect of, "Well, that's not what the church taught us." I mean, I believe, they were having a discussion about abortion or something like that. He said the church teaching is that this is bad. And another student who was disagreeing with him said, "Yeah, but yes, that's true, but doesn't your church also say that you shouldn't use the death penalty?" And the young man looked at this person and said, "Well, the Pope's wrong on that." Like, okay, we have a church teaching, don't do this except in very rare circumstances. And then we have a devout Catholic who's saying, "Okay, I'm devout, but on this one, yeah, I don't, the Pope is wrong." You can have that. Um, or you can have things, we probably all had this for those of us who are in religious communities, of we're discussing something with someone and they just flat don't know something that you think that's pretty basic that they should know. Um, we run into this all the time, of people who, have grown up in a faith tradition, and then they'll say something to the grow up in a Christian faith tradition, and they'll say something effective. Jesus and God can't be the same person. Well, I mean, that's the mystery of the Trinity, right? Uh, so we we can make assumptions about what their beliefs are by their belonging, but we always have to take that with a grain of salt. Um, the other thing, that's negative that's hard about denomination is that denominational identity, belonging, works, but there's a lot of people who don't know what denomination they actually happen to be in. A lot of people, maybe not most, a lot of people don't know the denomination they happen to be in. People are really good at telling us what church they go to. They know their church, they know their community. But if you're a Baptist, which is a very congregational organizational structure, one, your church could be in multiple denominations. Two, even if you aren't, um, you might not know actually what denomination your church joined. Um, I grew up Baptist, and we never talked about that. It wasn't on the sign. It wasn't. We never talked about what organization we were in. Um, that's true in any congregational setting. You are going to have those kinds of things. Also, by the way, sometimes congregational settings have very extremely loose organizations. The Church of Christ is an example of that, where the organization is so loose that they define themselves on their church website, at least they used to, as undenominational, a term that doesn't exist. But the point being, they're not non-denoms, but they don't really have a denominational structure. They're a very congregational setting. Now, in that kind of setting, that leads to the possibility that congregations are going to be doing very different things depending on where that congregation happens to be. Does it mean they'll do that? No, but it does mean it's possible. A, a third example another example of this kind of thing would be in a denomination like the ELCA. The ELCA has a policy of being affirming towards LGBTQIA plus individuals. So the official ELCA policy is that it's okay to get married in an ELCA church. You can be gay and be a minister, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the ELCA also allow does not force local denominations to follow that official policy. So essentially what their policy is they'll say it's fine with us to have like a same-sex marriage, but we also, if your congregation refuses, does not want to do that, we're not going to punish you. You're still welcome in the ELCA. Okay, but then does ELCA members, given that policy, it's hard for us to say that membership in the ELCA is equated to being accepting of gay and lesbian relations. We have to do some kind of study on that. So those are the three B's. The three B's again uh, are belonging, behaving, and belonging. Those are the three things that social scientists look for when we're trying to categorize what is a religious person. Thank you for watching, and we'll have another topic next time. All right. Goodbye.